Recently, we talked about the fan results of a tournament we held for the best comics and their adaptations in 2019. Now we're going to be doing the same thing, except for with the worst results, as we count towards the absolute worst that 2019 had to offer. And once again, this was decided by subscribers on our community page. If you'd like to participate in future tournaments and other polls along with other posts and whatever else we think of, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you get to see those community posts as they come out. Now, let's begin. First up is The Gifted, a show whose presence here does not surprise me given that it was already considered by our viewers to be among the worst that 2018 had to offer, which included the first half of the second season. 2019 included the second half of that same season and what is now also the final season. And really, all the same problems are still in the show, but with one extra layer of disappointment. After spending most of Season 2's second half doing very little, The Gifted ended their season on a cliffhanger that did potentially open the window to really changing up the formula of the show. And with a show that desperately needed a shakeup, that felt pretty welcome. But now the whole thing is cancelled, and The Gifted is destined to end on a bunch of unresolved plot threads. Is that enough to make it among the worst the year has to offer? In my opinion, I can easily say that is absolutely the case. This is followed by a comic series I was reluctant to nominate to begin with, so I was quite surprised to see it take 9th place overall. However, it is hardly undeserved. The Suicide Squad series that had been running since 2016 ended last year with one of the worst final issues I've ever had to suffer through. It was bloated, pointless, unfunny, and lacking anything substantial to it. Everything about it fell flat, and given that following this, no new Suicide Squad comics were published for the rest of the year until the very end of 2019, I'm just left baffled by how DC chose to treat this franchise in 2019. The good news is, it might have just been to allow for some room in Year of the Villain, as Suicide Squad has returned with Tom Taylor writing it, and things are already going better than where we had left things off from before. I'm surprised that this got so many votes to a degree, but certainly less so when I consider how bad that final comic really was. After that is a movie that just hurts to even think about, because we have HELLBOY, with a great cast, R-rated, and very much wanting to draw on some of the lesser-known HELLBOY characters. And it's also one of the worst movies of the year, easily the worst HELLBOY movie of all time. I could very much excuse the lousy CGI effects, since that's the sort of thing that budget's gonna weigh heavily on, but from the very first stupid line of narration to virtually every dumb thing that comes out of HELLBOY's mouth, this is some of the silliest dialogue you'll ever see in a movie. Which is a shame because I really like this cast. I think every one of them had the potential to be great, from David Harbour as HELLBOY, which really felt right, to Mila Jovovich as the main villain of this movie, who could have been an awesome villain, again, if the writing were better. But this awesome cast had no material to work with at all. This movie is rough, a bad experience to get through unless maybe you have enough friends around to kind of make fun of it as it goes along. But even then, I would say HELLBOY barely qualifies as a sort of so bad it's good kind of movie. It's more boring and disappointing than entertainingly bad. At number 7 is the final season of Game of Thrones, and I have a lot of thoughts on this that I really couldn't fit all of into a short spot on a top 10 video. But given how people like Lindsay Ellis have already spent hours online tearing this thing apart, I also think most of my opinions are unnecessary to voice since they are largely in concert with just about everyone else. I will say this, since this is something I don't hear a lot of. The idea that this show's ending would have somehow been better with a couple of extra seasons to it is a bit of a farce to me. We all saw the same show, right? Because once they ran out of book material, the showrunners completely lost the ability to pace out the story properly. If we got more seasons, it would have just ended up like all the other later seasons in the show, where things would have dragged out for the first several episodes and then featured a bunch of crammed in, crazy battles and big moments in the last few episodes. That's the literal roadmap of the entire show in every single season, including the big stinky number 8. My second point, that I think is worth saying, is that I'm glad to have an ending rather than not. That book series is simply never going to be finished anytime soon, if ever, and I would absolutely have hated to wait for even more seasons, or even longer, for more of this dragged out mess. Because I've never, ever had an ending that has made me get over a franchise so quickly. I don't really care that much about the lore, the series itself, or any potential spin-offs. I'm over it. This is the most I've thought of it since the finale, and I'm much more interested in talking about stuff like The Expanse now, which is the greatest current sci-fi franchise out there, possibly of all time. The shame of it all is that some of those battles, the acting, and the effects were spot on in the final season, right up until the very end. It was all very uneven in that regard, with stunning effects and amazing ambition for a television show, coupled with what should be the easiest part, writing the damn thing. But for whatever reason, we were stuck with characters doing massive heel turns for no good reason, and dismissing the entire mythology of the show in a single episode. The only solace I take in all of this is it seems to have utterly destroyed the two main creators of this show, and given how their past work has included stuff like X-Men Origins Wolverine, it kind of seems well deserved. Plus, this way they stay away from Star Wars, which is just perfect in my eyes. Next up is the Titans show, and yes, it is a little weird that Titans got more votes than Game of Thrones. I will say this, while Game of Thrones as a show had been heading downwards in quality for some time now, Titans went from being in the best of 2018 to the worst of 2019, both of which were decided by fan vote and presumably a lot of the same fans. That is a huge sea change, and one that I personally don't disagree with, and that fall probably has to do with a lot of Titans' placement on this list. Season 2 of Titans was deeply frustrating and disappointing, apart from the moments with Superboy and Crypto, which were amazing, but relatively small in terms of the actual amount of time the two were in the show. Everything about the Titans just sort of dragged things out with much gain. The crazy part of it all is the show had to essentially do cartwheels just to become less interesting so they could accommodate this. As in, they had to literally abandon everything to do with Trigon set up in last season and lock the Titans up in a boring version of their tower just to save enough money to make the show. And I found it a strange choice that Bruce Wayne was very clearly a British man attempting to affect an American accent very poorly. I mean, I don't actually dislike the idea of British Bruce Wayne, it kind of worked here, but him putting on the American accent and it being that bad, and personally, I'm not usually a huge stickler for accents, just left the whole show feeling pretty ridiculous. In one season, we went from a pretty entertaining character piece to a downright chore, and that's really tragic to see. Was it as bad as Game of Thrones? No, but I found the badness of Titans a lot more surprising. At number 5 is Men in Black International, a movie that constantly makes you feel like you should like it more than anyone has any right to actually do so. It has dialogue and a plot so bland and bad, it legitimately gives Hellboy a run for its money. Men in Black was just awful start to finish. It made me like some of the other Men in Black sequels a lot more in hindsight, especially 3, which was at least fun and entertaining in seeing Josh Brolin do a really cool Tommy Lee Jones impression. There's no big feature like that in Men in Black International, nothing fun enough to hold you through the movie. It's very drab, the international idea is wasted on England, and the very real chemistry between Tessa Thompson and Chris Hemsworth is utterly wasted. You can tell these two actors are struggling to bring this dialogue to life, and even though they're very talented, they just can't quite manage it because they have nothing to work with. Very little in the movie offers anything more than the most basic of movie experiences, and it's lucky it didn't rank higher, but unfortunately in that regard, it had some pretty stiff competition this year. Number 4 is Captain Marvel. And while I'm sure that's bound to spark a lot of productive discussion on all sides of the issue in the comments section below, I will say this movie was just simply boring as hell. There's this moment early on in the movie where Carol mockingly yells at one of the aliens she's fighting. It's a cute little bit where some actual character shines through that I really liked. What's disappointing is that I never really felt that moment of real life again in the rest of the movie. This is a big problem to me as we don't get enough of this human side of Carol Danvers. Even though that is the point of her time with the Kree, the movie could have been better structured in a way to show the Kree having this effect on her, either by not flashing back early on, or not flashing back at all, and her starting out as a normal human on Earth before the events of the movie start to unfold. Instead, for some dumb reason, we have to structure this movie like Batman Begins, and everything becomes very boring and generic because of that. The unwanted 90s nostalgia doesn't help anything here, but the general trajectory of her character felt off to me, and then we cap things off with one of the worst climaxes in a comic book movie in recent memory, with just such a dry CGI space battle that had no weight or feeling to it. I was really shocked by how little I felt out of anything in this scene. Marvel said they were done making these origin story movies years ago, so I have no idea what happened here, or why doing this like Batman Begins would somehow make for a better origin story, but it simply didn't. I'm getting really sick of these by-the-numbers origin story movies to begin with, but I'm especially sick of people trying to copy Batman Begins like this one so blatantly does. It didn't work for Man of Steel, and that movie came out a long time ago. So, what do you get when you mix in a trilogy that never seemed to have any sort of roadmap to begin with, a villain whose return was never even hinted at, and a mess of a movie that shuffles from one half-executed idea to the next? Well, that question is easy now, because at the number 3 spot, you get The Rise of Skywalker. I understand a lot of people like this movie in some sort of genial way. I have a lot of friends who have enjoyed and defended this movie to me for what it was. But I find they make an awful lot of excuses for the admittedly very difficult position J.J. Abrams was in when making this film. These are circumstances that Disney, and to a degree Abrams himself, created. I can tell you what I do take solace in, that while this movie was considered awful by our fans, and I don't disagree, it contrasts heavily with how highly voted The Mandalorian and Fallen Order were in comparison. Because of this, Star Wars didn't necessarily have a terrible year per se, but when and where it counted the most, they still kind of blew it. Because for the overall future of Disney Star Wars movies, if that's something collectively we even really want anymore, this movie should have been better to begin with. Thus, when it falters like this, it's much more dismaying.
Ladies and gentlemen of NASA, this is Charles Xavier. Help is on the way.
At number 2 is Dark Phoenix, a movie I don't remember hating when I finished it, but anytime I try and mount a meaningful defense on behalf of this thing, I find myself drifting to only a handful of scenes and moments I do like against a movie that otherwise just doesn't really work. There were a lot of moments when watching this thing I just had to ask why. Why do any of this Dark Phoenix stuff again when this movie is so close to the plot of X-Men The Last Stand and so far away from the original Dark Phoenix saga? With that stuff is all the old bad habits of these slightly newer X-Men movies. So once again, Quicksilver gets sidelined, and once again, the general Jennifer Lawrence of it all dictates a lot of the plot and choices in this X-Men movie. On the whole, it's a very disappointing take on what is gonna probably be the final X-Men movie featuring this cast. And I liked this cast. It's a real shame it had to end like this. Finally, at number 1...
I had a triplet, Julian, whom I absorbed in the womb and has resurfaced as a doll that's moving around my house causing mischief.
She's been rejected from college because she's too busy having sex.
And everyone was suffering from an acute case of quiz show fever.
What are you doing? Mom!
Listen to Mom!
Good morning, JJ. Let's see what the hot gossip in town is today, shall we?
I'm not sure I would recommend actually sitting down and watching the entire episodes, which really just sort of drag on and make no... And that's the list. Let me know what you think, and if there's anything you think didn't deserve to be on the top 10 here, or did deserve to be on the top 10 here and didn't quite get mentioned. Once again, the comics were kind of shunted out, but I think it's for the same reason that they were in the fan-created top 10. There was a lot of competition, especially from both the film and television industry this year, because as much as they had some successes, there were obviously also going to be failures along with it. That being said, I am not going to do another top 10 list for the comics. It feels unnecessary and like we'd be picking on relatively smaller fry comics if I did so. So that's it. We're done talking about 2019 for now. Thank you so much to everyone who participated across the 2 tournaments, and for those of you who watched this video. It was a lot of fun. But next up, we're moving on, because we actually already did a different tournament that I haven't actually covered yet, because this stuff was more time sensitive for obvious reasons. So we're going to go over what our fans think are the best Justice League members of all time, and those results are super interesting, so we'll get into those at some point in the future. Thanks for watching Comic Island.